and then my Vice Chair, Jonathan Ehrlich, who'll get a chance to introduce himself a little bit later. Before we jump into our agenda, I would like to take just a couple minutes for us to go around the room and give everyone a chance to introduce themselves. And Jonathan, maybe we'll start back with you.
Jonathan Ehrlich, Metropolitan Council. Deanna Belden with MnDOT Central Office, Performance Measures.
Anthony Jerby, City St. Paul Planning Department.
Kyle Burrows, Metro Transit, Service Development.
Cleo Carter-Hilberman, CTS.
Andrew Owen, Accessibility Observatory.
Ali Reza Khani, University of Minnesota, Civil Engineering Department.
Mark Vanderschaft, Metropolitan Council.
Aaron Bartling, Transit Planner for Minnesota Valley Transit.
Heidi Corcoran, I'm with Dakota County. I'm their transportation coordinator, but I work in community services, believe it or not.
Brendan Murphy, I work with the Accessibility Observatory with Andrew.
Paul Morris with SRF Consulting Group.
Krista Anderson, also with SRF.
Isol from Department of Geography and Environmental Science.
Pash Borla, Metropolitan Council.
Steve Ruick, Parsons Breaker.
Steve Wilson, SRF.
Brenda Thomas, CTS.
Very good. Thanks again, everybody. Just a reminder, following the presentation and panel discussion, we're going to have a brief council business meeting, so I encourage folks to stick around for that. It's probably 15 to 30 minutes, so it will be brief, but it's some important stuff we'll be covering, so please stick around. So without further delay, I'm going to get the presentation and panel discussion going. The way it's going to work is Andrew's going to give about a 25-minute presentation, and then while some other folks coming up to the front of the room to give some more dialogue around the topic, and then hopefully have lots of good dialogue with all you folks and questions. So I'm going to introduce Andrew. So our topic this morning is accessibility metrics for metropolitan analysis and planning, and Andrew is the Director of Accessibility Observatory and a research fellow in the Department of Civil, Environmental, and Geoengineering at the U. His work focuses on building and applying systems for collecting, calculating, analyzing, and communicating data describing transportation systems. And at the observatory, he leads the development and maintenance of tools to calculate nationwide multimodal accessibility to a variety of destination types. So please join me in welcoming Andrew.
Thank you very much, and good morning. Thank you all for being here. Before I say too many things, I want to make sure I get a thumbs up on, do I sound okay on the coming through on the microphone all right? I'll say a couple more words to check that out. I'm guessing that sounds okay, cool. Okay, so yeah, my name's Andrew Owen. At the Accessibility Observatory, we focus on accessibility metrics. As far as I know, we're the only research organization in the country that's really dedicated to this topic. It comes up in a lot of research areas, but we're focused on accessibility metrics as a way to advance and hopefully improve the way that we approach transportation and land use planning in the country and perhaps even around the world. So I'll spend just a few moments at the beginning of this presentation talking about the concept of accessibility, kind of framing the discussion that we'll have today. And then I want to share a handful of examples of how accessibility metrics can be used in analyzing and in planning metropolitan areas. And then finally, I'll share a little bit about a new project that we started a few months ago here at the university that takes a nationwide look at implementing an accessibility evaluation. And then finally, of course, I'm looking forward to our panel discussion where we will talk about how accessibility metrics can be used and what their impact is at different levels of government for transportation and land use planning. So first of all, what is accessibility? Well, in the context that we're using it here, accessibility is a measure of opportunities. It talks about what can be reached from different locations in space by different people. As a concept, accessibility is really very, very broad. As specific metrics, it's sort of a wide family of ways that you can measure the opportunities that are afforded people by the arrangement of land uses and the transportation systems that connect them. Let's jump straight to an example of what I'm talking about. We'll put some maps and some numbers on these to make it concrete. So we're looking here at a map of accessibility to jobs by transit here in the Twin Cities metropolitan area. For every block that's included in this map, and the Twin Cities metropolitan area includes about 60, 70,000 census blocks. For every one of those points, we measured from that location how many jobs can be reached within 30 minutes by transit. And we looked at this over time, 7 to 9 a.m., to make sure we're reflecting the influence of service frequency. In a transit context, that's very important. And the result is that for each of these locations, you can imagine it as an origin, and it's colored based on how many jobs you can get to from there if you're willing to spend 30 minutes traveling. So in the central area, we can see that accessibility values are around 250,000 jobs reachable within 30 minutes. So we can zoom in a little bit on the core cities of Minneapolis and St. Paul. And when you start to look at it at this level of detail, you can see some of the patterns of accessibility that are produced, again, both by land use patterns and by our transit system patterns. So this metric incorporates land use and transportation. Again, we can see that accessibility values are highest in downtown Minneapolis, but sort of peaks and corridors of accessibility radiate outwards from job concentrations, reflecting the travel time costs that it takes to reach those places of high job density. We can see locations where our rail transit system shows up very prominently along our Blue Line corridor in South Minneapolis. You can see bright peaks and splotches of accessibility corresponding with station locations. So the metrics that I've presented here are what's known as cumulative opportunity accessibility metrics. And that's a fancy way of just saying you count the jobs that you can reach and you add them all up. It's an intentionally simple way of implementing accessibility. And we've taken this approach because we think that it gives accessibility the greatest value for use in public conversations about transportation and land use. As I mentioned earlier, there's a wide variety of ways to implement accessibility metrics. Some of these get very, very detailed and require careful calibration of models. Those tend to be really useful in research contexts, but when you present a weighted accessibility index in a public meeting or in a planning forum, they tend not to be as easy to grab onto and to run with. So we like the cumulative opportunities approach because it gives people a number that's a count of real things out in the world. 200,000 jobs within 30 minutes in this case is something that people can easily imagine, discuss, and imagine what happens if this number goes up or what happens if it goes down. So broadly, accessibility measures the ease of reaching valued destinations. They incorporate both the benefits of travel and the costs of travel. So every time that a trip is taken, there's a benefit to that trip. And this is sort of the reason that somebody travels. It's what's at the end of the road. It's the motivator for that trip. Maybe it's a job, maybe it's a school, maybe it's some groceries. But there's a reason that we need to be in some other place, and that's the benefit. Every trip also has a cost, and we pay these costs because the benefits are worth it. But those costs come in a bunch of different forms of time, of money, of giving up other opportunities. Accessibility is an important metric because it encourages us to take this economic view of transportation, that every time someone decides to travel, it's because the benefits outweigh the costs. But both the benefits and the cost are really, really important to consider. If we look at only one or the other, we get an incomplete view of the reasons that people travel and the ways that our cities satisfy their needs. So if we look more closely at our metric of 200,000 jobs within 30 minutes, we can isolate, okay, well, there's a clear benefit to travel. If you're in one of these locations and you're willing to pay a cost, you can reach 200,000 jobs. That's a lot of opportunities that you can access, things that you can interact with, potential employment. Those jobs usually also represent opportunities for consumers. There are places you can go to buy things, to buy services. All of those benefits, though, come at a specific cost that we can quantify. In order to reach all of those opportunities, you have to be willing to give up 30 minutes of your time. And that's 30 minutes that you could spend doing any number of other things, including just sitting around and growing 30 minutes older. So again, accessibility metrics really help us to focus on the fact that all travel involves costs and benefits. The reason that this cost and benefit is so important, I think, is that it emphasizes how accessibility metrics differ from some of the metrics that we've seen widely applied over the past decades in transportation planning. We've seen a lot of use of really what are mobility metrics. And I don't want to set up mobility here as something that's a bad thing. In fact, mobility is one of the key components of creating accessibility. The risk is when we focus only on mobility. So mobility measures the ease of movement. How quickly can people or things move through space? That's a really valuable thing to be able to do, to move through space quickly. But it's not enough. Mobility itself does not justify the investments and the costs associated with operating transportation systems. We don't build highways so that people can drive fast. We don't build buses so that people can sit on them and ride around. We don't build trains so that people can sit on them and ride around. We operate all of those systems because of what's at the end of the trip. If we measure only how quickly we can move around, we run the risk of overinvesting in speed and underinvesting in access to destinations. So mobility looks just at the ease of movement, and it's an important component of creating access to destinations, the ease of reaching those destinations, which is measured more comprehensively by accessibility. Mobility really looks at the cost of travel. If I want to get to a particular location, how long does it take me to get there? Well, maybe it takes me half an hour. I'd love that to be shorter. I'd love it to be 27 minutes instead, or 25 minutes, or 20 minutes. And we can invest and invest in bringing that travel time down. But accessibility says, well, you're getting a benefit from that 30 minutes worth of travel. At some point, we reach kind of an equilibrium where the benefits are worth the cost. And beyond that point, we need to be really careful about what sort of investments we make that are targeted just at the costs, when maybe there's other places we could look to improve the benefits. So my main message here is that accessibility lets us talk much more comprehensively about how transportation and land use systems work together to provide people access to valuable destinations at costs that they're willing to pay. Again, in terms of time, money, any other type of costs. So measuring this, we looked at some examples, access to jobs by transit here in the Twin Cities. The data landscape that's available for accessibility measurement has improved dramatically over the past, I'd say over the past couple decades. We've seen a lot more information become digital. We've reached the point where we can do this not just for one metropolitan area, but for many. So we implemented this same measurement using the same methodology, not just for the Twin Cities, but for 46 metropolitan areas around the country. And that allows us, for example, to compare Minneapolis with Washington, D.C., using exactly the same methodology and data sources for both locations. And we can get a sense for how the absolute scale of accessibility varies between the two locations, but also how the patterns of accessibility vary based on the types of infrastructure and the types of land use patterns that each location has. Those examples look at transit. We can also implement the same metric for other modes. So we're looking here at a statewide implementation of accessibility measurement by car. How many jobs can you reach within 40 minutes from every census block in the entire state of Minnesota? I think this is particularly valuable because it's the same metric calculated with the same constraint for both transit and for driving, which lets us make very rational comparisons between two different transportation modes. We can also look at this in really any context around the country. So we can implement this for different states. And as I mentioned earlier, we'll talk in just a few minutes about how we're looking to implement this on a nationwide basis. So with that introduction of what accessibility metrics are, and in particular, this look at cumulative opportunities metrics, the number of jobs or the number of opportunities that are reachable, let's take a look at how accessibility metrics are being used to analyze and evaluate and plan metropolitan areas here in the United States. We'll look at three sort of broad areas of application. First of all, accessibility metrics are very valuable for research and analysis of metropolitan areas. And of course, we've had a lot of success working with that type of data here at the university. For example, we applied accessibility metrics to mode share modeling. So we found that using accessibility plus a small selection of demographic variables. So this is really a pretty limited scope model. We didn't survey anything. We used existing data sources from the census and then added in our accessibility data. We can explain about 2/3 of the variation in mode share at the block group level here in the Twin Cities. That's really, really powerful prediction from a small number of metrics. And we think that that reflects how accessibility metrics really get at the core value of transportation and land use systems. So we found that if accessibility goes up, for example, if you have an increase of 100,000 jobs that you can reach within 50 minutes by transit, workers in that origin location are almost twice as likely to commute using transit. So this is actually a really powerful tool using a limited number I guess I'll say with pretty easy to satisfy data requirements that gives you a lot of power in predicting travel behavior. We also found that the variation in transit accessibility, looking over time, how does accessibility vary from 7 to 9 a.m. as I watch buses and trains arrive and depart? That variation itself improves, excuse me, that variation itself improves that predictive power. So in places where accessibility is more constant, which is usually reflective of high transit service frequencies, people are more likely to use transit regardless of what the absolute peak accessibility is. Looking at an auto context, we applied accessibility metrics to analyzing the subscription patterns of hot lane users. So this is, locally, this is our min-pass lane system, where you buy a transponder and that lets you use our managed toll lanes with variable pricing that reflects current congestion levels. And so we were able to estimate how having access to those min-pass lanes changes accessibility to jobs from residential locations. So if someone in a particular area subscribes to the min-pass lane, they get access to free flow speeds on some key highway corridors. That improves their ability to reach more jobs in less time. And we found that that increment, how much accessibility goes up if you subscribe to our min-pass system, helps to predict the likelihood that a household will have a min-pass subscription. So this is really useful, even if we think outside of the infrastructure side of transportation planning. This is useful in marketing. Who do you advertise the min-pass system to? If we're trying to attract new subscribers, we need to know what are likely areas from which people might choose to use the system. The data that went into this actually contributed to a larger project that informed the current algorithms that set the pricing in real time. Like they're out there changing the price right now on our highways. And that's kind of an exciting thing to look at how accessibility is enabling us to make better decisions about real-time dynamic pricing of managed freeway lanes. So another broad application, or another broad area for use of accessibility metrics is in planning and evaluation of transportation and land use systems. So we looked at the impacts of a recently completed transit investment here in the Twin Cities. Just over a year ago, we started operating the Green Line, a new light rail system connecting downtown St. Paul to downtown Minneapolis, stopping here at the university along the way. And we were able to compare before and after, how does accessibility look in the region, and isolate the changes that are related not just to the entire project, the Green Line light rail infrastructure itself, but which ones are related to all of the supporting bus network changes that were made alongside that large capital investment. So we found that after the Green Line is in place, looking at all the changes that have, to the transit system over the past year, the average resident of St. Paul can reach over 200,000, that would be great, reach over 2,000 more jobs by transit in 30 minutes than they could before we made this change. And we can identify what areas experience the greatest increase in access to jobs because of this new investment. We also found that the impact of that light rail infrastructure investment is actually doubled by making smart, coordinating planning changes to the regional bus network. We thought that was a really important lesson in how it's not just about building infrastructure, it's about integrating new infrastructure into the existing network in a way that maximizes the total value in terms of increasing people's access to destinations. We also can look around the country and see examples of how, and this is typically taking place at the metropolitan level, so how MPOs are starting to incorporate accessibility metrics into their own planning processes. So looking at the Denver area, the MPO targeted as a specific performance metric, targeted increase in job accessibility by transit as one of the metrics by which they're evaluating their long-range plan. And so specifically, they're measuring the percent of residents that can reach 100,000 jobs by transit within 45 minutes. So they've included some assumptions in there, and it's important to recognize those. 45 minutes is a specific threshold that's been decided on, and that 100,000 jobs is sort of viewed as, okay, well, if you get to that level of job accessibility, that's a good minimum to shoot for. Beyond that, maybe the benefits of an additional job start to decrease. Below that, though, there's sort of a gap in, we really want these areas to be able to reach more opportunities to make them more vibrant, more successful for their residents, and actually more sustainable over time. Looking at the Salt Lake City area, Salt Lake City just went through a long-range planning process where they selected between a range of 5 potential alternative scenarios for their long-range plan. And one of the metrics that they used to select between those alternatives was an accessibility metric. And this one is interesting because it incorporates access to jobs and access to higher education opportunities. So they're specifically incorporating the fact that transit can be a very valuable way of connecting people who are at universities and colleges to classrooms and professors without having to build a large supply of parking at those education locations. So they evaluated the percent of the total jobs and education opportunities in their region which can be reached within 20 minutes by transit by the average person in the region. And we can see an example over here on the right of how they evaluated different scenarios across the bottom, and then the height of each bar reflects the accessibility, the total accessibility of each one of those scenarios, and they use that to select their preferred long-range investment scenario. We can also compare accessibility across metropolitan areas. Instead of looking just at one and using it in planning in that location, we can use it to compare how accessibility varies in different locations and learn some things about how different metropolitan areas perform in terms of connecting people to valuable destinations. So this is work that we did here at the Accessibility Observatory. Our report, Access Across America, Transit 2014, was released about this time last year. We're working on an update. And we presented an accessibility scorecard for 46 metropolitan areas across the country. We're really, really proud of the fact that we were able to implement this evaluation using the same data sources across all metropolitan areas. This is something that we think is really, really important because any type of metric, accessibility or otherwise, if it's implemented using local data sources and local unique methodology, there's some limitations to how valuable that is in learning about the big picture of how our different cities and metropolitan areas are performing. So that consistent methodology gives us a data set that we can use to make meaningful comparisons between different metropolitan areas, because we know that a number in one place means the same thing as a number in a different place. So that report provides a ranking of access to jobs by transit across all these cities. We've actually released some of the data for that report publicly in the hopes that it'll enable further research from which we can learn how our different metropolitan areas are succeeding or lagging behind in connecting their residents to valuable opportunities. So finally, I want to talk about the category of advocacy and transparency, or maybe we can call it public engagement for accessibility metrics. And I'm pretty excited about this because it sort of intersects the concept of accessibility with a lot of exciting developments we've seen in very, very recent years with online tools and mapping and data visualization that let people without really, really strong technical data analysis skills interact with complicated data, like accessibility. So for example, we've seen a tool come out of the University of Illinois in Chicago that measures access to jobs for the Chicago metropolitan area. And this is an interactive tool. I've only got a single image of it right here, but you can change the threshold that you're interested in, you can change the departure time, you can change a lot of the mapping scales, you can zoom around the metropolitan area, you can zoom in, you can take your own pictures. The idea here is to provide people a way to interact with this data for really any kind of use. But what I'm imagining is that this type of information can be very valuable to organizations that need to advocate for specific types of transportation or land use changes. It's a really good opportunity for showing, look, this is an area that would benefit from additional investment. It's lagging behind the rest of our city in terms of connecting people to jobs. Or this is an area where we made an investment and it's working really, really, really well. So we can highlight successes and areas for improvement across an entire metropolitan area. We saw some similar work take place a few years earlier in the New York, this was the Regional Plan Association of New York that sponsored this work. And this tool I really, really like. The links for these are down at the bottom of the screen, by the way. So you can change the location that you're interested in, and based on where you drop this pin and what mode you select, so you can use transit or auto or walking, you can see not only how many total jobs you can get to, but where those jobs are and what industry they're related to. So you can find out what areas have the greatest access to manufacturing jobs or finance jobs or education jobs, and then look at how that varies across an entire metropolitan area. This is a really, really powerful tool for someone to be able to sit down and use and say, I want to be able to say something meaningful based on real data about my neighborhood. Run a report like this and you can very, very quickly find out how that particular location compares to others throughout the metropolitan area. So I'm really excited to see the future of tools like this as a way to get local residents and organizations engaged with very, very meaningful and detailed metrics about the performance of their metropolitan area. So finally, as I mentioned, I'll just for a couple minutes talk about our recently begun National Accessibility Evaluation Project. This is a pooled fund project, which is a fun type of project to run because it lets you bring together a whole bunch of different organizations as sponsors and participants. So in this project, we're working with 7 state departments of transportation, plus the Federal Highway Administration. We're really proud to be working with our local state DOT, MnDOT, who's the lead agency on this project. And that's really an important role because it means that they stood up in front of the whole rest of the country and said, hey guys, we've got a project here in Minnesota that we think is going to be valuable, not just for us, but for the entire country. Come along with us, let's all pool our resources and get this done. So we're really excited to have all these partners. The goals and deliverables of this project are focused on measuring access to jobs across the entire United States. And that's at the census block level. There's about 11.1, 11.2 million blocks in the entire US. So one exciting thing is that this will let us continue our Access Across America series of reports. So you'll see an annual series of accessibility reports that focus on auto and on transit. So right off the bat, we think it's important to be multimodal. And then a key part of this is that we want to deliver accessibility resources to all of those participants in the project. So those organizations that you saw listed will receive directly block-level accessibility data sets for all of their states or other jurisdictions that they can use for absolutely any purpose, and in fact can share widely. That's an important part, I think, that I want to give this data not just to a state DOT, but let that state DOT share it then with local governments and planning agencies. Because this is scoped as a 5-year project, we're also looking forward to making annual updates and improvements to the methodology. For example, expanding to other modes like walking or biking, building new communication tools, maybe inspired by some of those ones that we saw for New York or Chicago. I hope you'll follow along with our progress on this project. I'm really excited about it. You can find out more about our organization, that project, or accessibility metrics in general at our website here. And of course, you can follow us on Twitter. And I better wrap it up there because I want to hear from our panelists instead of me. So thank you guys very much. And I think at this point I should invite our panel up. Since I still have the microphone, I get to do the inviting. And I will hand it off to Jonathan Ehrlich.
Thank you, Owen. Thank you, Andrew. And I think, does it work with the camera if we have the panelists sit up here facing you since the guys closer together, or to move the chairs over here?
You can do either or. Do you want to turn off the screen so you don't get the screen in your face?
Sure, let's turn that off. Right. So let's have the panelists sit up here, and we'll sit down because there's not that many of us in the room, and have a slightly more intimate conversation.
Make a request, if you have questions, please speak them into the mic, or panelists keep the questions in their mics, the online audience can hear.
Okay, and I'm just going to briefly introduce the panelists themselves. Who is the Director of Performance Risk and Investment Analysis in MnDOT's Office of Transportation System Management. Her responsibilities include development and delivery of MnDOT's annual transportation performance report. This year, she played a lead role in work identifying and documenting efficiencies pursuant to state legislation passed in 2014. Prior to her work in performance measures, she worked as an economic policy analyst and a transportation planner. She has an MS in urban and regional planning and an MA in economics from the University of Iowa and a BA in economics from the University of Oregon. Kyle Burrows, who is a transit planner from Metro Transit, he has been with the agency as a planner for a little over 2 years and was previously an intern. His route planning work is focused on northeast Minneapolis and the north central suburbs. He has also been involved in a number of long-range planning and policy efforts, including the Metro Transit Service Improvement Plan and the update to the Transportation Policy Plan. Kyle holds a master's degree in urban and regional planning from the University of Minnesota and a BA in economics and political science from the University of Wisconsin. And Anthony Jerby, who is a senior city planner at the city of St. Paul. He is collaborating with interdisciplinary groups focusing on transit-oriented development and street improvement projects. He has led a project to create the first street design manual for the city based on complete streets principles. He received a Master of Community Planning degree from the University of Maryland with a focus of urban design. And I think my first question for all of the panelists is just to describe the work in about 5 minutes or so that you've done with accessibility and the way that you see accessibility as a metric influencing your personal work and the work of your agencies. So starting with Deanna. And it looks like we have a microphone here, so you can pass that down as well. It only projects over the internet, so you can't hear it in here.
Oh, okay. So my work right now in performance measures.
You want to switch your mic? Give that one to her.
So we're glad to have a way to measure connecting people to their useful destination, rather than just measuring how fast people can get around, like Andrew described. How easily they can reach their destinations. So it allows us to expand our suite of metrics, and how we're using it right now would be, this is the second time in our transportation performance report where we've included a map showing the accessibility in the metro, Twin Cities metro area. It's the jobs within a 20-minute drive of the morning peak period. Now, as we get more years of data, we would eventually, because the answer here for this year was 495,000 jobs. So eventually we would like to track that over time and have a bar graph, that shows hopefully that it's improving. So that's,
I'm going to give you this one.
Okay. Do I need to say all that again?
No, I heard
Okay.
it just got better.
Okay,
I'm going to
okay.
give you the best microphone I can possibly get.
Okay. And anyway, and in our report here, it's under congestion and context. So it's on the Twin Cities freeway congestion page where we are including this expanded look at mobility. So we also need new measures to show the benefit of our investments in our transportation network. So while we are trying to manage congestion, we all know there's so many confounding factors, and here we have where congestion has rebounded since the recession, but the good news is that accessibility actually did not, decrease in a corresponding way. So we are looking for other ways to show those benefits. Now, of course, that could be land use changes. We can't, say specifically whether it's our investments, but we definitely are responding to, we need different and new ways, expanded ways to look at this issue. So that's the kind of higher level in the performance measurement and reporting. But at a project level, we are always wanting to expand our toolbox of transportation decision-making tools, where we can and where it's appropriate. And while the majority of our program is preservation, and we might not look at accessibility when we're deciding that we do need to keep a highway in good working condition, not all of it is. And so it could be a big opportunity at the project level and in the project development process. I could see us using this data that comes out when evaluating project alternatives. We could also use it as a criteria when we for selection for different competitive funding programs that come along. In our SIMS program in 2013, which was our corridor investment management strategy, for that program, we did include an expanded benefit cost model that included not only the traditional transportation benefits and that we see, the travel time and reduced vehicle operating costs and improved safety, but also some environmental and social factors. So this kind of thing could fit into there for evaluating projects in a competitive funding program. Also, we're embarking on I-94. There's Brian Isaacson. People might know him. Is in a different position now to look at a corridor vision and what we might do between the downtowns. It's going to be at least 2 years he's in this new position, and he's definitely looking for a way to evaluate what would be the best things to do, I guess is how I would say. And he's wondering, if he's imagining where, if we needed additional, or if we added additional connection points, how would what would the benefits look like? So this kind of tool, we'd be able to look at that. So he's thinking about whether he might include accessibility in that what he's doing with that project.
Great, thank you. So as Jonathan noted in my introduction, I'm a transit planner with Metro Transit, and most of my day-to-day work focuses specifically on doing bus route planning and route changes. But I also do get involved in kind of larger scale regional projects like transportation policy plan, for example, or Metro Transit's service improvement plan, which is not a regional document, but still kind of a large document, future-looking document that Metro Transit had. So I really see accessibility in the long term applying to really all of those different types of work that I do as a transit planner, and that's really kind of three sort of main categories. So the first one, I think that's kind of most obvious, and I think what's happening now already is sort of the look back, using it as an evaluation metric to see, on an annual basis, how has accessibility changed in our region, this year versus last year versus the year before, and that can kind of lead into the conversation of, the next step after that is like, okay, why did this change? Did we make a transit investment in the Green Line, for example, and that's why we see, in Midway and St. Paul really improving, or, did jobs decline in a particular area, so now there's sort of fewer jobs overall to have access to, kind of starting the conversation on those questions and really evaluating how we're all doing as regional transportation and land use planners. The second piece, I see accessibility really being important as sort of a look forward, an evaluation tool for potential alternatives. So, for example, in Metro Transit's service improvement plan, you know, that's a long-range plan that is currently unfunded. But one of the metrics that would be really useful for us to communicate to policymakers and other stakeholders is if we were to make this investment in our transit network, overall, here is the overall impact to accessibility to jobs or accessibility to, you know, any other thing that this investment would have in our region. And here is specifically where those improvements would occur. So, you know, which areas are benefiting the most, which areas are maybe not benefiting as much, and can we go back and maybe add in a couple of, or kind of tweak that plan to make sure that we're getting the accessibility improvement that we want in the locations that we want. And then the third piece that I think would be what I would be doing more on sort of a day-to-day, just transit route tweaks and maybe making a small, making small changes, you know, here or there. And this is kind of farther down the road when, you know, accessibility gets sort of easier to calculate from generating the transit network component here, but is, okay, so I have, you know, we have a possibility to make, you know, we've got the options to you know, make a few improvements. It's not the scale of like a service improvement plan or something like that. It's not going to be a regional document, but like, you know, we've got, you know, some money, a few hours available. How can we make a change to a route, you know, to really kind of maximize accessibility, or how do we evaluate between there? And then also, you know, kind of what is the added accessibility of a particular route to the overall network, I think would be a really interesting thing. So how valuable is one particular route to the overall sort of picture of accessibility? And, you know, I think we would probably be surprised that there are some, you know, kind of maybe low-key crosstown routes out there that people don't really think about that are really essential key pieces to our transit network. And I think it'd be really useful to use accessibility as a tool to kind of help identify that type of thing. So those are kind of how I see accessibility playing out in the work that I do in transit. So.
Well, my work at the city, I kind of work on different scales from citywide to down to sites, and I can get in the weeds pretty quickly, so I'm going to try my best to kind of keep it larger scale. But I see a couple kind of major applications of accessibility and accessibility metrics. One is citywide comprehensive planning, which I can kind of touch in on a moment, and the other is regional rapid transit planning. And I have a couple examples. One being the Green Line LRT project. There in as you saw on the maps, is already starting to show up as kind of hotter spots on the accessibility to jobs map, and concentrating density in jobs and housing along the Green Line is, you know, one of our major economic development initiatives. We have several policies in our comprehensive plan about focusing jobs along the Green Line, along high-frequency transit. And to implement this, we rezoned most of that area around the Green Line to allow the highest densities outside of downtown, even as high as downtown in some areas. And we're only kind of just starting to see the development come in, but has really been picking up speed as the Green Line has been successful and ridership has been so high. So by concentrating the jobs and housing along this, you know, transit line, we're increasing accessibility in the region, and, you know, we've seen developers wanting to go there because it's a place where they can build density without having to provide as much parking. They can leverage kind of the existing auto traffic network and then have access to this great transit resource. And as you kind of get smaller in scale, one of the things that we've been looking at dealing with accessibility and even down to mobility is all the north-south roads along the Green Line and 94 corridor. How can we work to make those less of a barrier for folks trying to access the transit and make these station areas where people want to develop kind of a more pedestrian-friendly place where it's kind of focusing on the benefits of the transit or benefits of moving and transit and lost my train of thought. Anyway, the other example I had was the Gold Line BRT running from downtown St. Paul east into Washington County. There's again BRT rapid transit bus line dedicated right-of-way on the north side of 94. And there, we're looking at accessibility in terms of what side of 94 do we put on. So our preference was that it's on the north side of 94, so that is due to proximity to higher density housing that's existing and opportunities for redevelopment. On that corridor specifically, there's less opportunity for rezoning and redevelopment as we've done on the Green Line. So there is kind of focused on a smaller scale. Many of the neighborhoods where there'll be transit stations along the Gold Line don't have sidewalks. The really kind of minutia of, you have to focus on the mobility there to get people to the station. And also looking at the infrastructure improvements of the stations and where park and rides are located and how they relate to opportunities for economic development, so we're not just kind of plopping people in a spot and then they get on the train and don't stop and kind of get a coffee or drop off the dry cleaning and that kind of thing. So it's looking for opportunities for to create more jobs and have kind of a spin-off effect of these transit investments. One thing we've heard in that process is that, especially on that side of St. Paul, employers want people who can get to their business reliably. And for a lot of jobs, kind of food service or retail jobs, many folks are transit dependent, and we've heard from employers that they can't, they've wanted to keep people on, but they couldn't because the transit system wasn't reliable enough. And if somebody's going downtown later in the afternoon or in the evening, they miss their transfer, and that half-hour commute turns into an hour or an hour and a half, and that's the difference between hiring somebody and not hiring somebody. So being able to have things like the Gold Line and Green Line where you've got a train or bus going every 10 minutes is huge for accessibility. Then to circle back to the comprehensive planning, we'll be embarking on updating our comprehensive plan in the next year onward. And I think looking at these accessibility metrics can really influence our policies and our analysis of the city. I also think it's important to look at placemaking, especially as it relates to transfer points and areas where we're investing along transit to make places that people want to be, because I think in addition to just adding density for housing and jobs, you want the places to be attractive themselves and people to want to be there. That's it for me.
So one of my interests the last couple of years has been how we take research concepts and convince ourselves that they're actually ready for and useful for implementation. So 11 years ago, the university hosted an international symposium on accessibility, and it's been a significant issue for the university and a significant project for the university continuously since then. I'm hearing a lot of very small steps towards implementing accessibility in our own comprehensive planning frameworks on a statewide, regional, and local level. But obviously, most of these are very early steps. So I guess the question could be phrased in two ways. One of them is, what are the barriers, institutionally or otherwise, towards using accessibility as a real decision-making metric? Both traditional barriers and any remaining barriers, and what do you think that the Accessibility Observatory or other state or regional bodies can do towards influencing decision makers of the importance of accessibility or the utility of accessibility for decision making? And maybe I'll start with Kyle and then go to the end.
Yeah, so I think there are a couple of barriers that I see, and as a relative newcomer to professional transit planning in the region, I think I'll turn it over to other folks to discuss kind of more of the long-term stuff. But for the certainly in the technical aspect, I alluded to in my sort of kind of opening remarks. That sort of using accessibility as an individual kind of route analysis tool is difficult right now because of the kind of the labor intensity of getting the proposed changes into a format, into the GTFS format that Andrew and the Accessibility Observatory uses to model transit networks. And GTFS is the Google Transit feed specification, which is what powers Google Maps if you plan your trip using Google Maps, and a lot of other trip planners actually as well. So, and actually I think it's general transit feed now. But getting the data into that format is still right now labor intensive. I think we're on the cusp of making that not as labor intensive, which will be very helpful for us in using this measure as a tool. The other big barrier I see is helping key decision makers in both inside of agencies and policymakers understand the importance of this tool. There's both a kind of a communication aspect to that, which I think Andrew and the Accessibility Observatory has done very well at crafting that message of why this is important, and I think that work is good that's continuing. I especially think it's a good idea to use the cumulative jobs measures rather than this kind of weighted thing. But that barrier kind of still remains. It's like, why, we've been doing something, for however many years, whatever, it works okay right now. Why is this better, right? And so kind of continuing that conversation, I think, is important.
Okay, well, I think at MnDOT, any changes in moving our huge ship is going to take forever. But in our project selection process, bulk of our program being infrastructure preservation, it comes from technical models, and then there's tweaks to how we select those projects. But I would say where it would be appropriate would be, like I said, in these small programs, and I don't think that it's been ready yet, but when we're going to get additional data, I don't know if we would call it a tool that we would get, or if it just would be some smart person in our agency would be able to, help evaluate what the accessibility benefits would be for project proposers in a competitive funding program. I'd say my office would be proposing that as soon as we could. The other barrier just generally to new things is the new things that we're trying to look at I'm surprised I forgot it had been 11 years, but like I would call it base research in monetizing. And I had kind of a question for Andrew where, I mean, obviously MnDOT is the lead agency of the pooled fund. We love it, but like more as maybe an audience member, I have a question for Andrew of talking about, our traditional benefit cost analysis, we would include changes in travel time for an improvement on a corridor. And you're talking about, okay, so that's focusing on the cost, but then the benefits of the change of accessibility, but we don't have a way to monetize, how much are we willing to pay for an increase in accessibility. And so, I mean, that I just imagine has to be at some point there would be some either debate or research on that, because so now that's why I can see it as we use multiple things to select projects when it's not just a preservation project, but we would want to look at accessibility, but we certainly wouldn't be able to throw that in the same way, monetizing it. And plus there would be the double counting, since mobility benefits are what help affect the accessibility. But we're just not ready, but we're inching there.
I think a barrier at the city level could be just you need to start explaining accessibility, and people's eyes would kind of glaze over. I think the focus at the city is really just kind of at such a small scale. But I really like that example from New York, where you can look at a neighborhood and talk about, oh, you have access to this many jobs in this neighborhood and these types of jobs. I think that could be really useful, especially talking to whether it's the mayor's office or council members, and say, look in your ward, you have this kind of diversity, what you need to do to either diversify access to different jobs or build on this access you have existing in your ward. And that could help kind of get people to support access.
So I'll take a moment to respond to Deanna's question, which is a really good one, because we've built a planning and decision-making, really an infrastructure almost, a procedural infrastructure that revolves around monetizing the benefits of investments. And we've become very adept at monetizing different aspects of it. So the question is, well, how do we put a dollar sign on a change in accessibility in a particular location? I think we have already some really good indications of components of how to do that. I haven't seen a comprehensive way of saying this is the dollar value of this accessibility change. But some of those components are so one thing that I mentioned during my presentation is research that indicates the relationship between accessibility and mode share, aggregate mode choice. And so that gives us an indication of how a change in accessibility by different modes will influence the mode decisions that people make, which can help us estimate, okay, if we make these types of transportation and land use plans, what will that do in terms of encouraging driving traffic, encouraging transit traffic, encouraging bike and pedestrian traffic. And those are things that we already have ways, sometimes they're debatable ways, but ways of incorporating into monetized investment decision making. Another component is so accessibility kind of takes a big picture, long-term view of the systems of transportation and land use. And so really a good way of evaluating them, turning them into money, is to look at land values. And we've also seen some research that indicates that changes in accessibility will show up in the change of the price of residential home sales. If the accessibility in a location goes up, that becomes a place that is attractive to more people because more and a greater variety of jobs can be reached from there. You have more people bidding for the same limited quantity of land or housing. You'll see a change in price. And so potentially some of the benefits of accessibility can be quantified as the increase in property values. And that's something that we're also pretty good at measuring. It's not something that we've traditionally looked at in terms of the impact of transportation investments. Those are public investments, and there's sort of, I think, a reluctance to look at, okay, well, how does that make individual people richer? But the fact is that it does. We built the Green Line. It increased the value of land along the Green Line, and some people sold property for an enormous profit because we made a public investment nearby. We can quantify that change, and if we feel odd about who is gaining that benefit, we should think about addressing that. But we can quantify what that financial benefit in terms of increased land value is.
It's important to emphasize, I think, that happens also in traditional transportation decision-making as well. We have traditional transportation decision-making measures which say that if 72,000 people each save half a second, that's 10 hours that you can monetize and makes the project worthwhile. That's also actually abstract and actually nonsense, but we use it for evaluation as well. I mean, in larger numbers, I think it's meaningful, but we do that with small numbers too. But we always have looked at private benefit from public investments, and so it's worth emphasizing that. But I want to let Deanna respond both to Andrew and to me, and then let others ask a couple of questions.
Yeah, and I agree with what you said there, just Jonathan, but even just the history, I mean, that we have worked the economic research into that, you know, it's become pretty well accepted that we calculate travel time, and we use Federal Highway Administration guidance on calculating the value of time for our region. And so it's not that it's unattainable, it's just that we don't have kind of that background of support of how to do that. And it's, you know, everything is contentious. And the other thing I would say too to Minda, it was not at all, I don't want this to sound like an excuse, but we have a bunch of confounding things that we're trying to emphasize. We would like to improve folks' quality of life, but we also have been told by the legislature to prove that we're being efficient. And so, you know, that's why it takes a long time. And oftentimes, you know, we do things for we build projects that don't have a traditional benefit costs over one, because there's other reasons to select a project, like community support and, you know, well, maybe or maybe not economic development benefits, but anyway, we have to keep all of this in mind, and it's just, there's no other way other than it goes slowly. So.
I think we have about 10 minutes for questions for either Andrew or the panel, and do you have?
Questions we got online.
Oh, yeah, some questions.
Don't want those people to get overlooked. I think these are two quick data-related questions for Andrew. The first is that your research can obviously show the how putting in transit lines affects accessibility to jobs. Can it do it the other way? Can you figure out where you should ideally locate new jobs with your data, or would that be a different kind of study that we'd have to do?
It's a great question. I like the fact that it gets at the fact that you can change land use just like you can change transportation. It's possible to do both. One of the core complication of doing this sort of work is calculating travel times and doing a lot of them and doing them very quickly. Once you get good at doing that travel time calculation part, which direction you calculate the travel times in and whether you aggregate at the origins or the destinations, all that actually becomes very, very flexible. So it's possible to come up with a metric, like the question is implying, of saying, to this I'm going to say this sort of like Yoda would, to this location, how many people can get? So you can look at that place and say, okay, if I locate a business here, what will that do in terms of my access from people's households to get labor to come and work at my business? And it's also possible then to say, okay, if we add a bunch of jobs here, if we add 1,000 jobs here versus over here, what's the difference? That location choice is going to play out differently in terms of how many jobs people can get to. If this location is close to a freeway exit or close to a transit station, that will have a very different accessibility impact than locating a bunch of jobs in a place that is far from existing transportation infrastructure. So both of those types of analysis are possible. Thanks.
Thank you. Quick follow-up question. Based on the location of today's jobs, in which part of the Twin Cities region would it make the most sense to make a highway expansion to improve accessibility? And they gave examples of urban, suburban, rural. What's your take?
So that's a very interesting question, and it gets pretty detailed. So an easy answer is, well, you should put jobs near existing highways. But the question really was about where we should be building highways if we want to increase people's accessibility to jobs. Actually, off the top of my head, I don't have a good answer to that. I can think of a couple different sort of candidate answers, and I'm thinking of some problems with both of them. It's a question I would love to study. I think that probably the simplest guess is to say, well, we should focus on improving travel times to downtown Minneapolis and downtown St. Paul. The question then becomes how to do that. We're at a situation where we can't really build new highways into downtown Minneapolis or into downtown St. Paul. So we've got to think about changing travel times in a different way. We've seen some indications of ways to do that in MinPass rollouts. That's a different type of investment and a different type of decision because it's about pricing capacity instead of adding capacity. So I think I'm going to have to leave it at that without turning this into an impromptu research project right now. But it all comes down to looking at how to change travel times to existing job concentrations.
I'm interested in thinking about this. I'm really intrigued by, how do we think about monetizing the increase or the change in accessibility? And this is for anyone to answer. We have a state agency, we have a regional planner, and then we have a local city planner. When I think about the Green Line extension from downtown Minneapolis Southwest to suburban Minneapolis or Eden Prairie, certainly the business community and the chambers of commerce they're a little bit at odds with the controlling caucus in the state legislature. And yet that's sort of the key pinch point, at least putting aside City of Minneapolis and Minneapolis Park Board, in terms of voting for timely funding for certain aspects and milestones along the Green Line extension. How do we sort of think about this from the people who are holding the purse strings and the big purse strings for the state match for any federal funding? And, using accessibility as a way to convince. Is it an education process? Is it a communication thing, or what?
Who wants to take that one first?
What are we still trying to fund? I guess I can't address that.
So I think the basics of the question is the value of accessibility increases the land value, which is a benefit for, say, residents for the Green Line extension, for example, Eden Prairie, and for the tax base of the city of Eden Prairie. But the people we're expecting to fund the project are the state and the counties and the federal government, who don't necessarily directly receive that benefit. And how do we reconcile that?
I mean, I again don't have a very great answer, but it reminds me of similar problems we have of different type of quality of life benefits being in the eye of the beholder, and part of the difficulty in monetizing. And we're thinking about bicycle improvements and how those would not be viewed the same way all across our state, whereas we all can definitely agree that we want fewer fatalities. We can't always agree that we want more transit. So I'm not sure.
Yeah, I think I'll sort of punt on this question as well. I think if I think accessibility will help add to that conversation, but I think trying to convince different levels of government and different decision makers and different people, whether they're policymakers or just average citizens, that they should support something that they don't directly benefit from is always been a challenge in a society like ours. And I think it might be particularly complicated with the higher stakes the funding becomes, and then with transit, some people have sort of ideological opinions about transit, whether, regardless of the merits of a particular project. So, I mean, accessibility can't hurt. So that's, I think, where we would go with that.
I'm going to try an apolitical take on that question. Our conversation right now about who benefits and who should pay for the Green Line extension is focused on the current residents along the line. And it makes sense because those are the people who are able to show up and talk about it and are able to call their representatives and things like that. An investment of that scale, if we decide to make it, will last for many decades. It's probably most important to talk about what things will be like 25 years from now, 30 years from now, maybe even 50 years from now, if we decide to make this investment versus if we don't decide to make that investment. No one's really having that conversation. It might be an impossible leap to make, to talk about the wishes of people who might live in Edina 30 years from now versus the people who currently live in Edina. We don't even know how different they will be from the current residents. But it's important that we keep in mind that we're trying to make decisions that will set the stage for a wide variety of things to happen in the future, rather than building something that will instantly change people's behavior and travel patterns the first day that it is in operation, because it's going to be in operation if we build it for many, many, many days, not just that first one. In order to make the right decision in cases like this, we need to think much, much longer term than our current conversations and processes allow us to.
Hi, since I am more towards the research part and talking about the marginalized part, two things I can think of is from statewide and stuff, we usually will have a cost related to the congestion, right? And also we have a cost related to the environment cost, like use moves to estimate the environment. So one possible part will be if we can provide the same accessibility to the region and change the how that we're going to be able to reduce the congestion cost. It's not like we bring new money in, but we can reduce the money out. Does that make sense? So that is the first thing I can think of. The second thing is actually research has been done with if we increase the transit and other alternative modes rather than driving, how that we're going to promote the public health. So there is a research in Salt Lake City talking about if they study before and after new transit line built, how the physical activities increase, and how that will going to affect the public health. So respect to that, that could be another new monetized part that can somewhat persuade some kind of persuade people that that there will be benefits, that we can see it. So that's the two things I can add on.
Thank you. Those are good. And so I also didn't mention that MnDOT has a partnership with Smart Growth America that we're now doing a third phase. And one of the things we are looking at is the public health benefits of how to include public health benefits in assessing, choosing projects. And so, thanks.
And I know time is short, so maybe instead of asking the question, I'll pose an opportunity for you or suggest an application for this whole thing. There's an article in the paper last week, Greater MSP, which promotes regional development here. They're not struggling with too high taxes or really bad infrastructure. They can't get the workforce to come to the Twin Cities. It's a labor force shortage. So I'm wondering about the opportunities for the region to look at its accessibility relative to other places in terms of promoting the Twin Cities as a place where people could come to work. And I suppose there's even opportunities at a local scale to say, you know, for the St. Paul Port Authority to be able to tap in and say, this is an area that's very accessible. This is an opportunity for a business to come in. So I'm posing that as an opportunity for the future to really make use of accessibility as that promotional tool.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I guess I don't know enough about how we rank in the different accessibility modes, but I think that's something we're always looking at too, is how we rank nationally in terms of bike infrastructure, transit, travel times.
I like that idea a lot. And I'll add one piece of it. It's one thing to measure accessibility, and you can look at a map and say, hey, look, you know, you should move to the Twin Cities and find a job here because we've got all these points on this map where you've got access to lots of jobs. The question is there an apartment available for you in one of those locations? Is there a house that you can buy in one of those locations? It's, I think, a really big opportunity here is intersecting this sort of accessibility data with the housing supply question. It's something that nationally has been a huge topic. We've seen that places from which you can reach desirable jobs, like all of San Francisco, become very expensive very, very quickly if there are constraints on housing supply. Adding those two things together can, I think, provide some interesting insights and guides for attracting people to work in different locations.
I'd like to thank Andrew and thank all the panelists for a great discussion, and thank all of you for showing up here, both in person and online, for this experiment for an early morning presentation and early morning meeting, and invite all of you to stay for the CTS Council business meeting immediately following.